Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and if you're like me, good night to all the artists out there. And today I'm going to be covering the basics of how I color and the entire process. Most of what I talk about today will be how I kind of do things, but I'll also be including some things that I don't necessarily do, but I know how to do. So yeah, my goal is to make this as easy to understand as possible so that you can apply it as quickly as possible. So let's jump in. One thing I really want to include in this tutorial is how I set up the layers, because that was something that frustrated me a lot when I started. So I'm going to be sure to include that and show you how I organize my layers too. Most of what I'll be showing today will be recorded and explained to you in Clip Studio Paint, but I think most of what I show can be applied to most other drawing programs out there. And as you can see here, everything that I'll be talking about will be applicable to both illustration and webtoon, webcomic art styles. So here's the basic rundown before we get into the nitty-gritty. So we're going to be doing the line art, the base, the flat colors, and then we'll be going into the shading and then the finishing touches and the correction layers. There's also a different workflow method that involves shading in grayscale and then coloring using gradient maps or a color layer like you can see here, but I'm not going to talk about that too much since that's not how I usually do things. Okay, so going into this, let's just assume that you have all your pretty line art drawing finished at this point. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is set your line art layer with the reference layer icon. It looks like a little lighthouse. This is especially useful if you like to use the bucket tool for filling in things rather than the lasso tool. Speaking of which, the bucket tool is pretty useful for filling in things very quickly. However, I don't typically use it myself because it leaves a lot of gaps that frustrate me later on, so I prefer to use the lasso tool. That's kind of just a personal preference. You can use whichever one you want, and if you do go the bucket tool route, you're still going to be using the lasso anyway, just to fill in those gaps that the bucket doesn't fill. And for the lasso tool itself, you're definitely going to want to use the quick lasso tool and not the standard one. You can see me using the quick lasso here, and this is typically how I prefer to fill in base and flat colors. Like I said, it's much more tedious, but by the time you're done, you'll be thankful that there won't be any headaches later on. And also, as you can see here, when I'm making an illustration, I tend to fill the entire figure with one color like this, and I usually do it like with a middle level gray like this. But it doesn't really matter what you use as long as it's not too bright or too dark. And one really nice thing about creating this one color base is that you can create an entire selection of the entire figure silhouette of the drawing and use that for whatever purpose you might need to use it for. You know, maybe for background purposes or creating like a border effect. So now you've got your line art and the base filled underneath it, so let's go over the layers and how I organize them start to finish. So of course we got the line art layer set as a reference layer, we have the base set all the way at the bottom, and then there's a folder that contains all of the base colors inside. Yes, I know that looks like a lot, but trust me, it's actually very, very simple. Each one of the layers here is the flat colors for each part of the character. And there's a layer for the hair, the skin, each article of clothing, etc. And you'll see that each one of these layers has a layer clipped on top of it, and each one of those is the shading layer that I use to shade and add shadow to each part. And by the way, you can just ignore the layers that have like the green icon, those are just for demonstration. But the clipped layers are the ones that have like the red bar to the left of them. That just means that they're only able to be drawn on top of whatever the layer that they're clipped to below. And then on top of the folder with all the base colors and shading, we have the mood layers, which is multiply, overlay, and then any additional rendering that you want to add on top. And then after that is the correction layers for any final adjustments. Okay, now that you can see how we'll be organizing each and every step, make a new layer separate for the skin, the hair, each article of clothing, etc. Make a new layer separate for the skin, the hair, each article of clothing, etc. And the reason I like to make a layer for each thing is just so that everything's isolated and I can just clip new shading layers to every element individually. It just makes the whole process a lot more organized and stress-free. And just like the base silhouette, you can make a selection of each individual part to do whatever you need to do this way too. And as I'm demonstrating now, whenever you start actually doing the flat colors, make sure you pick colors that aren't too saturated or too bright, and especially too dark. Depending on your art style, a more saturated palette or brighter color can work, but definitely do not pick a color that's too dark. And the reason for that is because when you're shading, when you're lighting, you want to have a little breathing room to work with the base color that's underneath. You know, if it's leaning too much in one direction, too bright, too dark, then it's hard to get the results that you're going to want. If it's too bright, then any lighting that you do is going to not really show up unless you have a really dynamic lighting setup, which we'll get to later. And for shadows, if your color's too dark, then your shading's not really going to pop out either, so just be mindful of your flat color choices. Okay, so you got your flat colors done. Now go ahead and clip a new layer to each of your individual elements, and those layers will be where we start drawing and applying the shading. Okay, so on to shading itself. Basically, I like to do what's called the 2-layer shading method, and this is applicable to both like cell shading and illustration style shading. As you can see here, most of the first shading layer is all like the same color, and then the second layer will be adding any additional areas where more shadow is needed. And you can make 2 layers for this, or you can shade it all on the same layer. And if you do it all on the same layer, something that's useful is the lock transparent pixels tool. And this allows you to basically color only on whatever you've already drawn on said layer. Now, when it comes to picking colors to shade with, you're going to want to pick the flat color that you've got with your eyedrop tool, and in the color wheel, you're going to move down and then to the right. So of course your shading color is going to be darker, of course, but also more saturated. The reason for this is because if you don't saturate your shaded color, the shadow is going to look rather dull in comparison. As you can see here on the box on the left, I'm picking the flat color that I'm shading on, and then I'm moving down and then to the right. And for illustrations, I typically use normal blend mode layer when I'm shading, but when I'm shading for webcomics instead, I use the multiply layer for faster and more efficient shading. And what I'm showing here is how the shadow looks when you darken it and saturate it at the same time. And here's a little comparison of darkening and saturating and just darkening your shadow color. Now the next thing I want to bring up is something I like to call shadow carving. And this involves just using the lasso or any type of way of blocking in a big chunk of shadow. And this is just extremely useful for laying down any important shadows, or if you're making a cel shaded art style. It's also very important for webcomic and webtoon making. Another thing I want to talk about when it comes to shading is abusing the airbrush tool. Now the airbrush tool is extremely helpful and useful if used correctly. And what I'm showing here on the screen now is an example of not using it correctly. This is a pretty common mistake that I see a lot of beginner artists making, is over-relying on the airbrush tool to do the shading for you. Now, there's 2 kinds of shadows. There's hard shadows and there's soft shadows. Hard shadows by themselves can actually look very good, and that's basically what a cel-shaded art style is. However, soft shadows on their own, 99 times out of 100, is not going to look good. Typically, for more of an illustration art style, you want a healthy mix of soft and hard shadows. So hard shadows work fine by themselves, hard shadows mixed with soft shadows works great, and soft shadows by themselves usually does not. I highly advise prioritizing hard shadows first and then incorporating soft shadows into your shading later on. And what I'm showing here is one good way to properly use soft shading in tandem with the lasso tool. As you can see, this technique is simultaneously creating a hard shadow and a soft shadow. This technique is extremely effective for blocking out any areas where you don't want your shading to go. Another thing I want to briefly discuss is the difference between cast and form shadow. Form shadow is the darker part of the form itself, obviously, and the cast shadow is the shadow made by the form itself that's cast onto the surroundings of the form. And this is something you want to keep in mind if you have hair strands or arms in front of the light source that block parts of the body that you're drawing. Okay, and now I'm going to briefly explain to you how I shade each element of a character. So for the skin on the first shading layer, I shade using the 2-layer shade method, and then I like to add another layer where I add red around joints, the cheeks, or wherever it's a bit darker, and then I lower the opacity a little bit. Okay, now when I shade the eyes, I shade the top half with something dark, typically using a multiply layer, and for the bottom half I typically do the same but with an add glow layer. You can also use normal blend mode layers too, but I typically use the multiply and add glow layers. And finally, I make a shading layer over the entire eye and shade the top half of it, covering the entirety of both eyes. On top of that, I sometimes add a screen layer blending mode to add a reflection on the top half of the eye. And for the hair, I also use the 2-layer shading method, just like the skin. Typically, the hair is going to be darker near the roots, wherever it binds together, or near the ends of the hair strands. For characters with more lustrous hair, I like to add a little bit of gleam and shine to it using either a tool or just drawing it manually. And finally, to add some more attention to detail, sometimes I airbrush the color of the skin around the face so that the hair can have a bit of see-through towards the end of the strands on the face. It's a very subtle detail. And lastly, for the clothing and any accessories, I continue to use the 2-layer shading method. However, how you shade each article of clothing or item is heavily going to depend on the texture of said item. I highly recommend looking up references for anything you're not familiar with shading or coloring. Alternatively, you can try different textures in the Clip Studio Paint store and see what works for you. Either way, shading different materials would take lots of practice. And lastly, one final little general tip I want to give on shading in general is just making sure your detailing is cohesive. And what I mean by that is kind of what I'm showing here, where certain parts of your drawing are heavily detailed and shaded and other parts are just flat and have next to no detail. This is a common mistake I see, and generally I think it's more attractive to have either a full commitment to full detailing or just having a more simpler style. Okay, now that shading is all done, I'm going to go ahead and go into key lighting and adding overall tone and ambience. And for the following layers that I'm going to talk about, we're going to clip those above the folder layer but still to the base silhouette that we started with. That way any new layers that we're about to make will apply it to the entire drawing. So what I'm showing here is a multiply and overlay combination, and I'm showing different kinds of combinations that you can use to improve like the dynamic lighting and ambiance that your drawing can have using different combinations. And I'm filling these layers, these multiply overlay layers, with either an entire filled canvas or an airbrush effect or some kind of gradient. Now the next thing I want to talk about is on these multiply layers, similar to the shadow carving that we talked about earlier, you can actually carve out the light and create dynamic lighting scenarios by erasing with the quick lasso tool. And I really enjoy doing this because it gives me pretty satisfying results more often than not. As you can see here, I'm creating a very dynamic lighting scenario very quickly. I highly recommend experimenting and coming up with your own multiply and overlay combinations and then carving out the light to see what kind of lighting scenarios you can come up with. Different colors and lighting scenarios can result in different times of day that you can mimic. Like using orange colors here leaves us with an evening aesthetic. And another thing I want to show here when it comes to lighting is bounce light in the Terminator. And bounce light here, you can see I already applied during the shading stage, but if you don't do it during the shading stage, then you can do it with the soft light layer blend mode. Lastly, you can see the Terminator added here, which overlaps the light into the shadows. The example here is a little exaggerated, but it's the red and it makes the lighting appear more realistic. And the last part when it comes to lighting that I want to talk about is something that I've kind of yet to put into practice and master myself, but it's light rendering versus dark rendering. And what I mean by that is when you choose what to put more effort into rendering, either you want to choose the brighter part of the image or you want to choose the darker half of the image. And the example here is from Pinterest. I don't have a good example of my own yet, so sorry. Alright, now we're going to move on to some of the finishing touches that you can add to spice up your finished product. First thing I want to talk about is the screen layer blending mode. Screen layer blending mode is useful for making certain elements of your art pop out less and fade into the background, and it really adds to the overall ambience of your art. Typically, I apply this with an airbrush tool and then lower the opacity if need be. Another thing you can do is clip a new layer to your line art layer and then color on top of it to blend the line art more into the colors of your character. This makes everything look more natural and more like a painting rather than a drawing. It's just personal preference on how you want your lines to look. Okay, so next I want to briefly talk about visual effects. So things like fire, magic, different kinds of elements. And for this, I like to experiment with drawing different shapes, maybe using different textured brushes and messing around with blending modes such as vivid light and add glow to create really cool effects. For example, here I started with normal layer blend mode, then I made a new layer with vivid light, and then I finished off with add glow to do the fire. I also like to spice things up with different blur filters like radial blur or Gaussian blur. To be honest, a lot of it is experimentation though, so just experiment and find out what you can make. Next, I want to talk about correction layers. That includes things like brightness and contrast, hue, saturation, posterization, level correction, color balance, and gradient maps, to name a few. You can find these under the layer menu, and these are mostly used to make any final adjustments to your drawings after it's mostly finished. So here you can see the difference between the before and after when I was finished with mine. Most of them are pretty self-explanatory when you use them, but some of them require a bit more knowledge to use properly, like posterization and gradient maps. Obviously, gradient maps can be applied like any other filter to give your drawings a completely different look, but they're also useful for coloring and grayscale, and also you can just lower the opacity of them and give your drawing a slightly different shade of whatever gradient map you apply. If you use Clip Studio, you can find a lot of different gradient maps in the Clip Studio store. Give them a try, they're quite fun to experiment with. And lastly, for the correction layers, I want to talk about posterization. Now, at first glance, this filter looks kind of ugly, but you can adjust different levels of it to your liking and then lower the opacity of it and then erase parts of it that don't look very good with the airbrush, and you end up with a lot of extra detail that you wouldn't have had otherwise. It's not something you want to go overboard with, but it's a nice little trick to give your art a little extra oomph of just random detail. As you can see here, after erasing certain parts of it, it actually doesn't look too bad and it actually adds a little bit extra to it. Now for your very last step for any final adjustments is using Liquify to adjust any things that you think might be problematic to your final product. And the reason you save it for last is because you're going to merge everything that's visible to a new layer and then adjust the entire canvas using the Liquify tool. After this point, it is hard to go back and fix or change anything previously done, so I recommend doing this for the very end. And with that, everything should be pretty much done. So we started with the line art and then filled in our base, and then we filled in the flat colors on each separate layer for each part of the character. and then we clipped layers to those flat colors and then shaded each part of it, the skin, then we did the hair, and then we did the clothing and accessories, and we did the eyes. Once the shading is all done, we close the folder and then we start applying any multiply or overlay layers to create our key lighting or any ambiance that matches the kind of background that we're trying to make. After focusing in the rendering and finishing what we need to there, we use correction layers to make any final adjustments that we need to improve the overall look towards the end. If there's any minor errors, we use Liquify to quickly adjust those, and we're pretty much done. And I'll also quickly go over how a webcomic or cel-shaded art style is any different. It's pretty much the same, but the only difference is instead of shading each element of the character individually, I just add a multiply layer over the flat colors, just one single multiply layer, and shade everything from there. And other than that, it's pretty much the same filters, same correction layers, same lighting, and yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. Thank you for tuning into this tutorial. I hope you learned something. I might not be the best at explaining things, but I hope you got something from this. If you were confused at any point or have a question, don't be afraid to ask in the comments. If you made it to the end of the video, comment and tell me something that you learned. Anyway, this video's gone on long enough. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see y'all later.